My 1969 Mustang, a classic, a true piece of American history, was parked right in my driveway. It was my pride. The kind of car you don't drive, you parade. But for the HOA, that was a problem. Yes, because my beloved neighborhood, full of bored ladies with too much time on their hands, thought that an old car was a threat to the aesthetics of the neighborhood. This aesthetic consisted of identical houses, white picket fences, impeccable lawns, and a house arrest vibe for anyone who didn't follow the rules to the letter. The first warning came on a folded piece of paper on my door. The HOA, in a tone of voice that only a bunch of unoccupied people can manage, said that my car was not in compliance with community regulations, and that I had to keep it in the garage or remove it completely. Oh, right, because everyone has a little extra space to cram a 5-meter-long car in with all the junk they've accumulated over the years. I ignored it. I wasn't going to give in to the madness of a bunch of people with time on their hands. 2 weeks later, a second warning, now more aggressive, with a threat of a daily fine of $50 if I didn't remove the abandoned vehicle. Abandoned? The car was in perfect condition, washed and waxed weekly, running better than the bland sedans these people drive. I did what any reasonable citizen would do. I threw the notice in the garbage can and got on with my life. But I underestimated the ability of this woman, the supreme queen of the HOA, to butt in where she doesn't belong. Karen, the president of the committee, thought she had been sent directly by God to ensure that no one dared spoil suburban perfection with any trace of individuality. The third notice came with an even more serious tone. If the Mustang wasn't removed within 48 hours, it would be towed away. I laughed, a laugh of pure debauchery. I thought it was just another empty threat from someone who has nothing else to do. But then came the shock. When I woke up the next morning, the car was gone. The Mustang had been towed away. My blood boiled. I ran to the door, looking for an explanation. That's when I saw Karen standing across the street, holding her inseparable notebook. She was there, as if she had just committed the perfect crime, and, to complete the scene, that satisfied little smile of someone who thinks they've won. I took a deep breath, because it was, at that moment, that many people would lose their minds. But not me. I was going to find a way to get my car back, and I was going to do it in the most glorious way possible. Because what Karen didn't know was that my uncle was a federal judge, and if there's one thing a federal judge doesn't like, it's abuse of power. The anger I felt at that moment cannot be described in simple words, because it wasn't just a car that had been taken, it was my Mustang, the car I had spent years restoring, adjusting piece by piece, spending every hard-earned penny to make it flawless. And now, it was who knows where, because some lady with the spirit of a neighborhood dictator decided that it spoiled the harmony of the neighborhood. But I'm not the type to take any crap. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to have one. The first thing I did was call the impound yard. They told me that yes, my car was there, and that in order to remove it, I would have to pay $500 in removal fees plus $100 per day that it remained there. Oh, and detail, I couldn't pick it up for another 3 days, because the yard doesn't release vehicles impounded by the HOA immediately. In other words, as well as stealing my car legally, these people were holding me hostage to make a profit. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out my phone, and did the only logical thing at that moment. I called my uncle. Now, let me explain something about my uncle. He's not just a federal judge. He's the kind of judge who scares even a corrupt policeman. A man who takes the law seriously, but who also loves a good fight when he sees injustice. And he hates the idea of a bunch of bums playing sheriff in some neighborhood. The call was short and to the point. What did they do? I explained everything. The letter, the threats, the tow truck, the absurd fee, the way Karen was looking down from her balcony, as if she owned the place. My uncle was silent for a moment. Then he said calmly, "Give me 30 minutes." By now I expected him to help, but I had no idea of the spectacle that was about to unfold. Exactly 35 minutes later, a black car pulled up in front of my house. Out stepped my uncle, in a suit, accompanied by 2 court officers. Not police officers, court officers. And the detail? They weren't there to ask me anything. They had already come with papers in hand. My uncle wasted no time. He went straight to Karen's house and knocked on the door like someone with a search warrant in his other hand. She answered the door with an air of superiority that already gave me the heebie-jeebies. But as soon as she saw the 2 officers behind him, her tone changed. "Good afternoon. Are you responsible for removing the Mustang from this property?" Karen hesitated. She looked around, as if trying to find someone to help her. "Well, as president of the HOA, I'm responsible for maintaining order in the community and—" "Yes or no?" My uncle cut in, out of patience. "Technically, yes." "Good. Then you're going to accompany me to the impound yard, because that tow was illegal and will be annulled right now. Now, for those of you who have never seen an HOA get its ass kicked by a federal judge, I assure you, it's a spectacle worth every penny." Karen tried to argue. She tried to say that the car violated neighborhood rules. She tried to insist that everything was done according to regulations. But with every word she said, my uncle countered with real laws. Was the car on private property? Well, yes, but does the HOA have a clause that allows vehicles to be removed from private property without official notice from the city? Well, not exactly. Did you know that illegal removal of property can be considered embezzlement and result in criminal prosecution? Silence. Karen was now pale. The neighbors started coming out of their houses, watching the scene as if it were the Super Bowl, because everyone there had been a victim of the HOA's absurd rules at some point. What happened to me could happen to anyone. In the end, Karen had no choice. She had to get in the car together with my uncle and the court officers. They went to the impound yard, and the owner, who already knew my uncle, didn't even want to talk. My Mustang was returned without a penny coming out of my pocket. Now, if that was the end of the story, it would have been a great victory. But it didn't end there, because while my uncle was sorting it out, he had a better idea. He filed a formal complaint against Karen and the HOA for abuse of power and violation of private property. And that, my friends, was just the beginning of her downfall. If getting my Mustang back without spending a dime had already been a taste of victory, knowing that Karen was about to be swallowed up by her own ego was the icing on the cake. What happened on the day my car was repossessed spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip in a condominium group. After all, it's not every day that you see a federal judge appear out of nowhere and reduce the supreme queen of the HOA to a pile of stammering and lame excuses. But the best was yet to come. My uncle, who is not the type to pass up a cheap abuse of power, decided that this situation deserved more than a simple public humiliation. He had already filed a formal complaint for abuse of power, but now he wanted to go deeper. He wanted to tear this woman from the throne she had built for herself, and the funniest thing? He didn't even have to try very hard. After the complaint, the court lawyers began to investigate how exactly this HOA was operating. My uncle, as a judge, had the right contacts for this, and it wasn't long before the first irregularities came to light. You know when you pull on a loose thread and suddenly realize that the whole garment is coming apart? That's exactly what it was. First, they discovered that the fine for removing my car had no legal basis. The HOA could only tow vehicles if they had been on public roads for a long time and had no license plates. My Mustang was in my garage, with up-to-date documents and a registered license plate. In other words, it was a legal theft with an HOA signature. Then there was another problem. The money from the towing fine went directly into the HOA's bank account and not into the towing company. That meant embezzlement. And then it was only a matter of time before more people in the neighborhood started raising their own complaints. One neighbor reported that she had been fined for putting an off-standard Christmas wreath on her door. Another man said he had to pay an absurd fee to change an inadequate fence that, in the end, was exactly the same as his neighbor's. Little by little, everyone realized that it wasn't just a whim of the HOA. It was a system set up to extort money from the residents, maintaining the illusion that everything was for the order of the neighborhood. And guess who was the brilliant mind behind it all? Karen. By now, Karen was feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. She tried to hold it together with the other HOA members, but even they began to realize that they were in a leaky boat. The first crack in her empire came when the HOA's treasurer, a gentleman in his 70s who clearly didn't want to be screwed over, decided to go public. He told how Karen manipulated the funds, how she created new rules out of thin air just to have an excuse to fine residents, and how some of that money went to administrative expenses, a fancy code for let's spend it on whatever we want. Oh, and the juiciest part, they discovered that Karen was diverting money from the HOA to a personal fund. Yes, this woman had literally turned the association into a private business disguised as community management. The result? A nice court summons arriving straight at her house. And don't think it was discreet. The bailiffs showed up at her house in the middle of the day, when all the neighbors were around, delivering the papers right in front of everyone. That image of her standing at the door, receiving a court summons, became the most talked-about scene in the neighborhood. But that wasn't the end of it. I imagined that after that, Karen would have the minimum decency to hide in her own house and accept defeat. But no, she decided to double down. The day after the summons, I received a letter from the HOA. A new fine, $1,000. The reason? Infraction against the aesthetic order of the neighborhood. In other words, Karen freaked out and tried to get back at me the only way she knew how, by making up a fine. Now, any normal person would have freaked out. But me? I just laughed, because I knew exactly what to do with it. I took the ticket, took a picture, and sent it straight to my uncle. He only replied with an interesting, leave it with me. And that's when Karen's house came crashing down. The letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox as a last pathetic attempt at revenge. A $1,000 fine for infraction against the aesthetic order of the neighborhood, as if my crime was simply to exist and breathe the same air as Karen. As soon as I read that, I didn't even get angry, not even a little. I laughed, because at that moment, it was clear that Karen had completely lost control of the situation. She was cornered, desperate to regain whatever crumbs of authority she had left. But the problem is that when a tyrant starts to fall, the more he whines, the faster he sinks. I took the paper and did what anyone with a modicum of common sense would do. I took a photo and sent it to my uncle. It took him exactly 3 minutes to reply. That's great. Now we can screw her for good. The next day, the HOA received a subpoena directly from the federal court. It wasn't just about the illegal attempt to remove my car, but also about fraud, abuse of power, and misuse of community fees. And that's when everything really started to fall apart. The investigation against Karen was already moving fast, because after my uncle pulled the thread of her corruption, the whole thing came unraveled. First, they discovered that she was diverting money from HOA fees into personal accounts. Small deposits over the years, amounts no one paid attention to, but when added up, more than $80,000 disappeared from HOA funds. The revelation caused a real riot in the neighborhood. Before that, many people were still a bit wary of picking a fight with her. After all, Karen was relentless. She fined, harassed, and threatened to ruin the lives of anyone who challenged her authority. But now everyone saw that she was just a cheat trying to play queen with other people's money. Residents began to gather to officially complain against her. People who had already been fined unfairly came forward with piles of documents proving that the HOA fees were imposed without any criteria. A neighbor who had been fined for leaving his garbage can in the wrong place showed that Karen only did this to people who didn't pick on her. Another guy revealed that he paid an absurd fee to change his fence, while his next-door neighbor, a personal friend of hers, didn't have to spend a dime. When the story hit the local press, it became a public spectacle. An entire article was published on the HOA that turned into an extortion scheme. There were photos of her house, testimonies from residents, and a detailed list of every abuse of power she had committed. Karen, who used to parade around the neighborhood with that air of superiority, was now completely cowed. People whispered as she passed, and some even looked at her with a satisfied smile. The tables had turned. She was no longer in charge of anything, but the best was yet to come. My uncle, being the genius that he is, discovered that the HOA had never properly followed the registration process for some of the rules. In other words, many of the fines imposed over the years were invalid. This paved the way for a class action lawsuit against it and the association itself. Yes, you read that right. The whole neighborhood sued Karen. Panic hit hard. She tried to argue. She tried to defend herself. She tried to shout that it was all legal, but the facts weren't on her side. And when the day of the trial finally arrived, Karen showed up with a lawyer who clearly already knew he was defending a lost case. She sat there, listening to neighbor after neighbor recount how they had been extorted, threatened, and humiliated for years. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of her leadership. The judge, who, ironically, wasn't my uncle, because he wanted everything to be done as impartially as possible, didn't have to think long. He declared that Karen was personally responsible for the undue fees, ordering her to return every penny stolen and pay compensation to the injured residents. But the final blow came when the court itself declared the HOA dissolved. That's right, the association was completely dismantled. The neighborhood would no longer have an HOA, and all the residents would be free to live their lives without being policed by a lunatic with a ticket pad. When Karen heard this decision, it was as if her world had ended. Because, after all, power was all she had. Without it, she was nothing. The scene of her leaving the courtroom was a delight. Her shoulders bowed, her eyes on the ground, her arrogance forcibly stripped from her. For the first time, she had nothing to say. No threats, no apologies, no cries of, "I'm right." Did she try to appeal? Yes, but without the money stolen from the HOA, she couldn't afford a decent team of lawyers. The case was quickly dismissed, and as if losing power wasn't enough, Karen was forced to sell her house to pay for the lawsuits. A few months later, she disappeared from the neighborhood. Her house was put up for sale, and another family, good people with no authoritarian tendencies, moved in. Best of all, the neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief. Without the absurd rules, without the ridiculous fines, without the constant threats. Finally, people could live their lives without fear. As for me, well, I made sure to celebrate in the best possible way. I took my Mustang for a nice drive around the neighborhood, accelerating just enough to make Karen hear me from wherever I was. And just like that, the reign of the worst neighbor ever ended. Was it overkill to use a federal judge to destroy an HOA? Maybe. Do I regret it? Not a bit. And if it were you, would you regret doing it? Let me know in the comments.